This is an episode that was originally made for my patrons on Patreon, part of a monthly series about the History Guy's hats, that now you get a chance to see this sneak peek on YouTube. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider becoming a patron. This episode lets me talk about a storied regiment and a battle that not only changed the course of a war, but represented a new era for a military whose contributions would prove to be critical during some of the world's darkest hours. It is history that deserves to be remembered. This is a type of cap that's commonly used in the British Army and armies of the British Commonwealth. That's sometimes referred to as a barracks cap or a forage cap because they were originally used for informal duties, and also sometimes called a peak cap because this piece here, which Americans would usually call a visor or a brim, the British refer to as a peak. This hat's from the 1980s, and actually these hats are going out of style. They're largely being replaced with berets. But one of the things that I like about these regimental caps is that while the designs are fairly similar, different regiments would use different colors or different piping, and they would all have a different cap badge on the front that represents their regiment. And as the regiments of the British Army and the former Commonwealth usually have long and storied histories, that means that each of these caps and each of these badges represents a unique window into history, and that is certainly true of this particular hat. On this badge is an 8-pointed diamond-cut star, with the star in a raised circle surmounted by a crown, and on the circle are the block letters V-R-I. Those letters are actually called an imperial cipher, which is, in essence, a monogram for a ruling monarch. What is odd about this badge, though, is that the cipher is outdated. A royal or imperial cipher is usually updated for the current monarch, but instead of the cipher for the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, VRI stands for Victoria Regina Imperatrix, meaning Victoria, Queen and Empress. So while this hat is from the 1980s, it bears a royal cipher from Queen Victoria, who died in 1901. And that actually tells us all we need to know where this hat comes from. Because while there were many regiments who were authorized to use the royal cipher in their badge, there was only one regiment in all of the empire that was authorized to continue to use Victoria's royal cipher in perpetuity. And that unique privilege, surprisingly, didn't go to a regiment of the British Army, but a regiment from one of the Dominions. This hat represents the Royal Canadian Regiment. The Royal Canadian Regiment was formed in 1883 as an infantry school corps designed to train the Canadian militia. And while they have a long and storied history, there is a particular battle and conflict that defined not just the reputation of the Royal Canadian Regiment, but the reputation of the Canadian Army in general. Britain fought numerous wars in the Victorian era as the island nation maintained the largest empire in history. And men of Canada serving in British regiments participated in those conflicts throughout the era. But it was at the very end of the Victorian era and the very beginning of the 20th century that Great Britain faced a colonial war so challenging that it required deploying a substantial amount of troops from its dominions outside their own borders. The Second Anglo-Boer War began in 1899 after long-standing tensions between the British and the two Dutch Boer republics in South Africa culminated in the Boers declaring war. The British government suggested that Canada provide troops for the conflict that would be absorbed into British units. At the time, the Canadian Army, or what was called the Permanent Force, was tiny, and the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry was the only infantry regiment of the Permanent Force. A wave of enthusiasm in English Canada allowed for strong recruitment of a force of some 1,000 that had a core of professional troops from the Permanent Force, augmented by volunteers. But the Canadian government wanted these troops to have a truly Canadian identity, and so instead of parceling them out to different British units, they were formed into a single battalion that was designated the 2nd Special Service Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry. The Second Anglo-Boer War was the first time that Canadians in Canadian uniforms fighting in a Canadian unit made war overseas. The battalion arrived in South Africa on November 29th of 1899 into what had already become a bloody conflict. At the outset, the outnumbered British forces in Natal and Cape Colony were quickly surrounded and besieged, but it had been generally expected that a quickly mobilized army corps under General Redvers Buller would soon overcome the Boers. But the British were using outdated tactics that had been developed in the colonial wars of the past. British generals failed to comprehend the impact of destructive fire from trench positions and the mobility of cavalry raids. The day before the Canadian battalion had arrived, the British had won a nominal victory, forcing the Boers to withdraw at the Battle of Modder River. While the British had managed to flank the Boers and force them to withdraw, the British had learned a brutal lesson in what the force's commander called one of the hardest and most trying fights in the annals of the British Army, after the British troops spent much of their time pinned to the ground, tortured by heat and thirst, unable to move as there was no cover from the Boers' deadly accurate fire. It was clear that the tactic of frontal attack by infantry only, that had succeeded so often against colonial opponents, was effectively impossible against an entrenched army using bolt-action rifles. It was a lesson that the British were slow to learn. As the Canadian Battalion spent a couple of months on line of communication duties, which was a critical time for the Canadians to train since they were largely inexperienced, the British Army suffered a string of devastating defeats at the hands of the Boer commandos. Between December 10th and 15th, the Boers had won 3 lopsided and bloody victories against Buller's armies at the battles of Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso. British losses had been so terrible that British press called the brutal time the Black Week. On February 12, 1900, the men of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry joined the 19th Brigade as part of a large British offensive intended to capture Pretoria, the capital of the Boer state of Transvaal. 6 days later, the Canadians would experience the full terror of what some have called the First Modern War at the Battle of Paardeberg. The new invasion force threatened the flank of a Boer force under the command of Piet Cronje that had won the victory at the Battle of Magersfontein in December. Cronje's force of some 4,500 Boers, hampered by a slow-moving supply train, was trying to withdraw when it was blocked at a crossing of the Modder River by British cavalry, allowing a 15,000-man force under the command of Lieutenant General Horatio Kitchener to surround them. The Boers entrenched themselves at a place called Paardeberg, which in the Boer Afrikaans language means Horse Hill. The situation was dire for Cronje, as the British had overwhelming artillery and could bombard his commando into submission. But Kitchener, who had gained fame fighting dervishes in the Mahdist Wars, and whom had been worried about Boer reinforcements, instead ordered frontal attacks on Cronje's prepared position, despite the lessons from the failure of those tactics in December. The attacks occurred on Sunday, February 18, 1900. One of the 2 regiments to lead those attacks were the Royal Canadians. The position was terrible. The Canadian troops, exhausted already from a long march, first had to make a difficult crossing of the Modder River. As one private noted, "We had quite a time crossing, as the water was up to our chins and the current very strong." Once across, they formed for the attack. The land sloped down to the Boer position for over 800 yards with no cover. The Boers opened a devastating fire at about 100 yards. The attack was stymied, and the troops that weren't immediately killed were pinned down by fire until they could retreat under the cover of night. Kitchener's force took over 1,100 casualties that day, the single greatest loss of life for Imperial forces in the Second Boer War. 78 of the killed and wounded were from the Royal Canadians. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. For 8 days, the British shelled the Boer position. While this caused few casualties among the entrenched Boer fighters, it destroyed their wagons and killed their horses and mules. Cronje's Boers were becoming increasingly demoralized. But it was the Canadians who would break the stalemate. The Royal Canadians were ordered to another assault on February 27th, again taking terrible losses. But instead of withdrawing in the night as before, with the help of the Royal Engineers, they dug trench lines that night less than 65 yards from the Boer positions. In the morning, the Boers found themselves looking down the barrels of the rifles of the entrenched Canadians. Realizing that his position was hopeless, Cronje surrendered. It was the first significant British victory and a clear turning point in the Second Anglo-Boer War. The 4,000 or so Boers that were taken into captivity represented nearly 10% of the Boer army, and the victory played a huge role in the morale of both armies and the eventual defeat of the Boer armies in the field. But it was also a turning point for the Canadians, who received a great deal of the credit for the victory. Field Marshal Lord Roberts, the commander of British forces in South Africa, said of the Canadians, "They were as good a lot of men as were in the British Army. Canadian now stands for bravery, dash, and courage." Major General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien said of the Canadians, "There are no finer troops or more gallant troops in all the world." The victory changed the British and the world's perception of Canada, as Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier said before the House of Commons of the victory of Paardeberg, "That day the fact had been revealed to the world that a new power had arisen in the West." From 1901 to 1914, Canadians would gather in town squares and round memorials on February 27th to celebrate Paardeberg Day, which was a day to celebrate the Canadian Army's first major victory in an overseas war, to recognize those Canadians who had served in the Second Anglo-Boer War, and as an affirmation of English Canada's loyalty to the Empire. Those celebrations largely ended with the coming of the Great War and have been replaced with Remembrance Day, which is solemnly celebrated on November 11th, representing the date of the armistice in that war. From that first deployment of a truly Canadian unit, the Canadian Army has gone on to play vital and gallant roles in some of the most important and bloody conflicts in world history, through the World Wars, the Korean conflict, the Gulf War, and into UN peacekeeping operations and the war in Afghanistan in the 21st century. Approximately 118,000 Canadians have lost their lives in overseas wars. Today, the Royal Canadian Regiment is the senior regular force infantry regiment in the Canadian Army, still ready to fight to defend Canada and Canada's vital interests. When Great Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, they brought their dominions with them. Prior to the Statute of Westminster in 1931, the dominions of the Commonwealth, including Canada, foreign policy was controlled by the British Parliament. The Canadian contribution to the Great War was significant. Eventually, some 650,000 Canadians would serve in uniform during the war. That's impressive, not just because the entire population of Canada at the time was only some 8 million, but that at the outbreak of war, the Canadian military was tiny, with a standing army of just 3,100 troops. Canadians made great sacrifice during the Great War, and it was the words of one Canadian who, perhaps more than any other, encapsulated the sacrifices made by all the soldiers in that terrible conflict. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Canada chose to create an expeditionary force, initially an all-volunteer force. The first contingent of the force, initially simply called the Canadian Division, was raised in August and arrived in England in October. The division trained on the Salisbury Plain over the winter and embarked for France in February 1915. Among the men of the Canadian Division was John McCrae. Born in Ontario in 1872, McCrae joined a cadet corps, an organization formed to provide young men with military training and discipline, at the age of 14. 3 years later, he joined a militia field battery. He was also studying to be a doctor, receiving a medical degree from the University of Toronto in 1898, graduating top of his class. Historian Linda Granfield said of him, "His ancestors included soldiers and physicians, and he carried on the tradition." But McCrae had another talent as well, publishing several poems and short stories. His poetry tended to focus on themes of death, perhaps influenced by the death of an early sweetheart. "Cast her not out, I cry. God's kind words come. Her future is with me, as was her past. It shall be my good will to bring her home at last." John McCrae, The Hope of My Heart, 1894. He spent a year serving with an artillery battalion in the Second Anglo-Boer War before returning to Canada and resuming his medical career. At the outbreak of the Great War, the 41-year-old physician was appointed brigade surgeon to the 1st Brigade of the Canadian Field Artillery. In the Boer War, he had been shocked by the inadequate treatment of the sick and wounded, but he felt an obligation to serve. He wrote to a friend, "It will be a terrible war. I am really rather afraid, but more afraid to stay at home with my conscience." In April, the Canadian Division was moved to the area called the Salient at Ypres. Ypres is a city in Belgium in the province of West Flanders. While spelled Y-P-R-E-S, the French pronunciation is Ypres. Still, the English who fought there often called the city Wipers. The Ypres Salient, meaning a battlefield feature that reaches into an enemy's territory and is surrounded on 3 sides, was created during the 1914 Race to the Sea, where both the Central Powers and the Entente were trying to outflank each other in the north. The area around the city of Ypres had been the scene of fierce but indecisive battle in the fall of 1914. The salient was a dangerous place for the Canadians and their allies, as the Germans held high ground around the city and were eager to straighten their line. While the Canadian Division had participated in a diversionary assault during the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March, they would face their first major test in combat at Ypres, including a terrible new weapon. The Germans had used fragmentation shells filled with a chemical irritant at Neuve-Chapelle, but the concentration had been too small to be effective. Another attempt in January using a more deadly gas on the Eastern Front against Russian troops had also largely failed, as in the conditions the gas had frozen rather than vaporized. In April, the Germans planned to close the salient at Ypres by using a much larger concentration of a much more powerful irritant, chlorine. The University of Kansas Medical Center explains, chlorine is a diatomic gas, about 2.5 times denser than air, pale green in color and with an odor which has been described as a mix of pineapple and pepper. It can react with water in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, which is destructive of tissues and can quickly lead to death, or at least permanent lung tissue damage and disability. At lower concentrations, if it doesn't reach the lungs per se, it can cause coughing, vomiting, and eye irritation. Chlorine was deadly against unprotected soldiers. At Ypres, the Germans had collected more than 5,700 cylinders, some as large as 40 kilograms or 88 pounds, of liquid chlorine. The chlorine would be siphoned from the containers, where it would vaporize and be carried by the wind to the Entente trenches. As chlorine gas is heavier than air, it would then sink into the trenches. The Germans had to wait for favorable conditions, and the attack was started around 5 p.m. on April 22nd against French colonial troops from Algeria and Morocco to the Canadians' left. The Entente troops were caught completely off guard by the attack, apparently convinced that the Germans would not use such weapons as they were banned by the Hague Treaty of 1899. The website Veteran Affairs Canada described the effect. As thick clouds of yellow-green chlorine drifted over their trenches, the French defenses crumbled, and the troops, completely bemused by this terrible weapon, died or broke and fled, leaving a gaping 4-mile-wide hole in the Allied line. German troops pressed forward, threatening to sweep behind the Canadian trenches and put 50,000 Canadian and British troops in deadly jeopardy. In a 1932 memoir, British officer Alfred Oliver Pollard wrote, "One cannot blame them if they broke and fled. In the gathering dark and the awful night, they fought with the terror, running blindly in the gas cloud and dropping with breasts heaving in agony and the slow poison of suffocation mantling their dark faces." McCrae wrote to his mother the next day, "As we moved up last evening, there was heavy firing about 4:30 on our left, the hour at which the general attack with gas was made, when the French line broke. We could see the shells bursting over Ypres. Of one's feelings all this night, of the asphyxiated French soldiers, of the women and children, of the cheery, steady British reinforcements that moved quietly past us, going up, not back. I could write, but you can't imagine." But the German advance was slow, likely because they were afraid of their own gas, and they were unable to fully exploit the new gap in the line. Counterattacks by the Canadians, who had no training in night fighting, gained little ground but managed to distract the Germans and allow the Entente time as they tried to close the flank. Lance Corporal Frederick Fisher, in command of a machine gun squad, was called up to defend a Canadian artillery unit threatened by advancing Germans. They covered the retreat, but his squad lost 4 men. The next morning he was again leading a machine gun team, holding the Germans from advancing into the village of St. Julien, when he was killed by enemy fire. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Canadian serving with the Canadian Expeditionary Force to be awarded the medal. On the 24th, the Germans attacked with gas again, this time directed at the Canadians in an attempt to take St. Julien. A Canadian doctor had sent word that troops should defend themselves by placing a urine-soaked cloth over their mouths, as the ammonia in the urine would counteract the chlorine. While the Germans were able to take the village, the Canadians held enough to keep the salient from collapsing. Veterans Affairs Canada explains, "This time the target was the Canadian line. Here, through terrible fighting, withered with shrapnel and machine gun fired, hampered by their issued Ross rifles, which jammed, violently sick and gasping for air through soaked and muddy handkerchiefs, they held on until reinforcements arrived." That night, Company Sergeant Major Frederick William Hall of the 8th Winnipeg Rifles exposed himself to enemy fire to retrieve wounded men of his company. He saved 2, but was killed trying to save the 3rd. He was the 2nd Canadian to be awarded the Victoria Cross for the battle. The fighting around St. Julien would continue for another 17 days. McCrae wrote, "It was hell at the time, and we really expected to die in our tracks. For 17 days and 17 nights, none of us had our clothes off, nor our boots even, except occasionally. And all that time, while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. On May 25th, Captain Francis Alexander Scrimger, medical officer of the 14th Battalion of the Royal Montreal Regiment, helped remove wounded from his hospital as Germans were advancing, carrying a wounded officer. He was the 3rd Canadian to be awarded a Victoria Cross in the battle. On the night of the 25th, Colin Campbell and Raymond Saunders of the 2nd Brigade of the Canadian Field Artillery were getting ready to bed down for the night when a shell landed nearby. A piece of shrapnel caught Ray in the head. He was taken to a field hospital but died 20 hours later. Colin would write later of his friend's death, "It is awful hard to lose someone one loves." He and some members of the battery buried their friend. Colin made the cross for the grave himself. He wrote, "It was the will of God that he had to leave all he loved and all who loved him in this world to meet them in the next. He wrote to Ray's father, promising to visit him after the war. He never got that chance. On October 10th, 1917, Colin Campbell was killed in combat. He was 22. Amid earth's vagrant noises, he caught the note sublime. Today around him surges from the silences of time a flood of nobler music, like a river, deep and broad, fit song for heroes gathered in the banquet hall of God. John McCrae, The Dead Master, 1913. On May 2nd, an officer in McCrae's battery, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, a close friend with whom he had served in the militia, was killed. McCrae wrote to his mother, "Heavy gunfire this morning. Lieutenant Helmer was killed at the guns. His diary's last words were, 'It has quieted a little, and I shall try to get a good sleep.' I said the committal service over him as well as I could from memory. A soldier's death." There are various stories regarding what came next, but the most accepted is that McCrae sat on the back of an ambulance and in 20 minutes composed what would be by far his most famous poem. A tribute to Helmer and the 6,000 Canadian casualties, nearly 1 in 3 men of the expeditionary force at the time of the Second Battle of Ypres. Veterans Administration Canada explains, "Wild poppies were already beginning to bloom between the crosses marking the many graves. Unable to help his friend or any of the others who had died, John McCrae gave them a voice through his poem. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from flailing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." John McCrae, In Flanders Fields, 1915. Witnesses say that he at first crumpled the poem, written 106 years ago today, not thinking it was good enough. A friend retrieved and convinced him to seek publication. The poem was published anonymously in Punch magazine on December 8th, 1915. Linda Granfield describes the public reaction. The public response was overwhelming. The poet's identity was subsequently revealed and his work became known as the most popular English poem of the Great War. In 2012, the New York Times wrote, "The poem was republished throughout the world, rapidly becoming synonymous with the sacrifice of the soldiers who died in the First World War." Despite its somber tone and its illustration of death, the poem In Flanders Fields was used in recruiting posters and bond drives. Granfield notes that some people argue that the poem's call to battle is unsettling, but others recognize that it was an expression of John McCrae's personal beliefs and an example of social attitudes of the time. If McCrae was a patriot, he certainly understood the price of war. In 1916, he wrote a friend that in Flanders, I saw enough fighting to do me for my natural life. Granfield says of him after the battle, people who knew McCrae noticed changes in his appearance and personality. He spent more time alone and looked older than he actually was. He no longer entertained companions with lively stories told with a winning smile. "I'm very tired of it," he wrote to a friend. McCrae was eventually promoted to lieutenant colonel, given command of a field hospital. On January 18th, 1918, worn down by war, he died there of pneumonia. He was 44. In Flanders Fields is still popular in Canada and around the world. It's often recited at Remembrance Day and Veterans Day services. It is considered by many to be among the most important poems about war ever written. Its allusion to red poppies sparked the Remembrance Poppy, those red poppies sometimes made out of paper that are distributed by veterans organizations to commemorate those who died in war, often in exchange for a charitable donation that goes to serve veterans' causes. Today is June 6th, the 78th anniversary of the Allied landings at the beaches of Normandy. The Allies landed some 156,000 troops on D-Day, either on the beaches or via airborne operations. And many said throughout those landings, chaos reigned. Yet somehow the Allies still managed to gain their foothold on Fortress Europe. There are so many stories of heroism and massive Operation Overlord. Among them, the story of the little-known 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. The Canadians are among the first allies to set foot in France on D-Day. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
According to the Juno Beach Centre, Canada's Second World War museum and cultural centre located in Normandy, France, the idea for a Canadian parachute battalion was inspired by the successes of British and German paratrooper operations in the early stages of the Second World War. Initially, however, the idea was not for offensive operations overseas, but as a means of defending Canada's vast remote areas. This was seen as necessary as the risk to having to defend Canadian soil from a foreign enemy became more realistic as tensions were rising in the Pacific and German U-boats were prowling eastern Canadian waters and even venturing up the St. Lawrence Seaway.
The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was created by the Canadian military on July 1st, 1942. It was constituted along the lines of the British paratroops and so included battalion and company commands and 3 infantry regiments. All told, 26 officers and 590 men of all ranks.
The Centre notes that recruiting for volunteers was at first difficult, as men were concerned that volunteering for the Parachute Battalion would limit them to home defense, which was, the Centre webpage notes, a prospect of little appeal for young men eager for action. Recruiting improved when the appeal was made to men who had already volunteered for foreign service, and the same appeal that was seen in the US and UK, the prestige of being part of an elite unit, drew sufficient volunteers. An April 2020 edition of the online news for Kirby Centre Canada quotes Lou Lamy, who volunteered for the battalion at age 17. I read quite a bit about it and heard about it. It was exciting. I told them that was what I wanted to do. All members of the battalion were required to go active, that is, to volunteer to be eligible for foreign service.
As Canada had established no infrastructure for training paratroops, the Canadian forces were trained in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The idea was to combine the best part of both training regiments for the Canadian program.
The group sent to the UK trained at No. 1 Parachute Training School at RAF Ringway. In the United States, training was done at the United States Army Airborne School, commonly called Jump School, at Fort Benning, Georgia. The risks involved were illustrated when the unit's first commander, Major H.D. Proctor, was killed in a training accident on September 7, 1942. Most men of the battalion would be trained at Fort Benning, but in April 1943, Canada opened its own parachute training base at Canadian Forces Base Shiloh, near Manitoba. Lamy told Kirby News, "We had to do 5 jumps out of the airplane to get our wings. I thought it was a lot of fun." Some of the Canadians trained at Fort Benning would become part of the 2nd Canadian Parachute Battalion, which would then be integrated into the 1st Special Service Force, a joint Canadian and American commando unit that became known as the Devil's Brigade. But the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was entirely composed of Canadians. Canada had a fully trained parachute battalion by March 1943. As the risk of home invasion had faded by then, it was decided to deploy the battalion overseas as part of the Canadian element in the United Kingdom. They would continue training at RAF Ringway, and while its officers were all Canadian, the battalion would serve as part of the British 3rd Paratroop Brigade, 6th Airborne Division. The unit would remain part of the Canadian Army, but be under British command. 31 officers and 548 men of the battalion shipped out for Britain in July 1943 on the Queen Elizabeth. Lamy said, "Everything seemed to happen very fast. I wasn't nervous. I was training as hard as I could to get there."
The battalion trained in England for another 10 months. They trained on special roles like operating machine guns and heavy mortars, as well as rigorous physical training. Finally, Lamy said, they told us that's enough training. It's time to go to work.
The role of the 6th Airborne Division at Normandy was called Operation Tonga, guarding the eastern flank of the invasion force. Their task included capturing 2 important bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal, as well as assaulting the Merville Gun Battery, the subject of another episode of The History Guy. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was selected to lead the landing. In fact, their first objective was to secure the drop zones for the rest of the division. The 3 companies were then tasked with various objectives, including destroying bridges that the Germans might use to move reinforcements. Company C was tasked with capturing the village of Varaville and destroying a bridge to the south that would be a likely route for German armor. Each with a 30-kilogram, nearly 70 pounds kit bag in addition to a knife, French currency, and enough rations to last them 48 hours, the Canadians were transported aboard 50 Armstrong Whitworth Albemarle transports jumping out of a hole in the floor the size of a bathtub. But despite all the training and planning, the jumps didn't go as planned. While they had been told the anti-aircraft would be light, in fact, the planes faced significant flak. Pilots attempting to avoid the flak, or having their planes simply pushed and jarred by it, broke from assigned flight trajectories. Paratroopers were thrown around, some injured inside the planes, and equipment became entangled. Pilots became lost or disoriented. Some drop zones were obscured by fog. Some men jumped early as they were anxious to exit planes that were under fire. Corporal Ernie Jean's plane passed the drop zone before he was able to jump. He was quoted in a 2004 edition of Canadian Military History. "I was number 19 in the stick of 20 in my plane. As I made my way to the door, I heard the engine rev up and the jumpmaster pushed me back. I thought to myself, we've come all this way to go back to England? But almost worse, the plane had to turn around and fly through the flak again to drop the last two paratroopers." Later, he discovered that the original 18 men had been dropped in the wrong place, and all were either captured or killed. Once dropped, the men faced more problems. Many of the pilots, trying to avoid the flak, didn't slow the planes down for a safe drop. Men lost their equipment, their carefully prepared 70-pound kit bags torn loose in the wind. Captain John Simpson was quoted in Canadian Military History. "The plane was going much too fast. When I went out, the prop blast tore all of my equipment off. The guy must have been going at a hell of a speed. All I had was my clothes and my .45 revolver with some ammo." Now many of the men were deprived of the heavy equipment that they needed to perform their missions. And they were at significant risk as they jumped. Many were injured, crashing into trees or buildings. Over 80 were captured almost immediately. The Germans had flooded many of the fields, knowing that there would be likely landing spots for paratroopers. That might mean being stuck in mud, but especially in the drainage ditches at the end of the fields, some 6 to 8 feet deep. Paratroops weighed down with 80 pounds of equipment could easily be drowned. The Toronto Star reported last November, the first Canadians to set foot in German-occupied France since the Dieppe raid in 1942, they came down in the dark. Many of them drowned in the swamps, flooded by the enemy. Others were shot on sight or were lost for hours before finding their marks. Once on the ground, many were nowhere near their drop zones. Lance Corporal D.S. Parley was quoted in Canadian Military History. "If you didn't know where the rendezvous was, they told us to face the direction of the incoming aircraft and move off to the left of their flight path. That was all well and good until I realized that every airplane that I could see was going in a different direction." The misdropped and lost men would dramatically affect the situation on the ground. The battalion lost 15 of its 27 officers in the jump. Reader's Digest Canada told the story of Corporal John Ross. He found his kit bag, pulled out his submachine gun and radio, and then scrambled over to the group, expecting to see all 120 members of C Company. He was one of only 32 paratroopers to arrive. The others were scattered all over the countryside, some dropping as far as 16 kilometers from the rendezvous point. Almost immediately, a new disaster. Allied Lancaster bombers were scheduled to do a raid to support the nearby attack on the Merville gun battery, but missing their targets, many bombed the battalion's landing zone. Many paratroopers were killed, the rest stunned by the huge blasts. In his 1995 book, Out of the Clouds, The History of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, author John Wills notes the condition of the company at the rendezvous. Over 100 men were expected to be at the rendezvous, but instead Major H.M. McLeod, commander of C Company, had only 15. The plans called for heavily armed troops with machine gun crews, heavy mortars, and Bangalore torpedoes, but the little band had only one Piat, projector infantry anti-tank gun, 3 Sten guns, 8 rifles, and McLeod's pistol. Still, Colonel Bernd Horn wrote in his 2010 book, Men of Steel, Canadian Paratroopers in Normandy, McLeod and the remaining men proceeded to the next objective, the capture of a series of defensive positions located on the grounds of Le Grand Chateau in Varaville. McLeod wanted to use speed and the cover of darkness to assist in his attack. He knew that these two factors combined with bold, aggressive action and surprise would offset his temporary lack of manpower. While they collected men along the way, the lightly armed paratroopers were not just outnumbered, but by far more than they imagined. Wills writes, C Company had been given the task of clearing out the enemy garrison at Varaville. Given the size of the force represented by C Company, the undertaking was formidable. At the Chateau de Varaville, a 75mm anti-tank gun and fortifications, which included bunkers and trenches, had been established to control the road intersection. This was manned by a much larger force than had been anticipated. McLeod wanted to engage the position as quickly as possible to prevent it interfering with the imminent landing of the rest of the 6th Airborne Division. They came to the gatehouse of the chateau, finding it to be empty, but clearly having been used as a barracks. In fact, the bombing by the Lancasters had prompted the garrison to move to their trenches. As they shot down on the enemy position, they discovered for the first time the presence of the 75mm anti-tank gun. Reader's Digest Canada writes, "Suddenly, gunfire sprayed the outside road, and a large shell crashed into the lower part of the building. A couple of dazed paratroopers stumbled out, unhurt. The answer was now clear. The Germans had retreated to a concrete trench fortified by machine gun bays and a 75mm anti-tank gun. We had only pistols, rifles, and a 2-inch mortar," said Corporal Ross. They were outgunned and outnumbered. McLeod tried to use the best weapon he had, having a corporal use their Piat, an infantry anti-tank weapon. The first shot missed the bunker containing the 75mm gun. Before a second shot could be fired, the 75mm gun responded. The shot rocked through the wall and exploded the remaining Piat ammunition. 5 of the 6 men in the room were killed or mortally wounded, including Major McLeod, none of whom, Reader's Digest Canada notes, had reached their 25th birthday. The Battle of Varaville was chaotic. The captain reported that complete chaos seemed to reign in the village. Against the background of Bren guns, spun-down machine guns, and grenades could be heard shouts in English and German. Horn quotes Battalion Deputy Commanding Officer Major Jeff Nicklin. "The Germans ran around Varaville like crazy men, shot at everything that moved. Even a moving cow got a blast of machine gun fire. They were so jumpy that they ran around in 2s and 3s to give themselves moral support." But slowly the paratroopers identified the enemy positions, and more paratroopers straggled in, moving towards the sounds of combat. Wills writes that the breaking point was when a paratrooper corporal moved to a position where he could direct fire bombs from a 2-inch mortar. He unloaded 4 into the enemy position. Wills writes, "He quickly crawled back to the deeper ditch, expecting at any moment to be the attention of much gunfire, but none came. A few minutes later, a white flag was raised at the bunker, and Corporal Hall, the only remaining medical man at the site, accepted the surrender of the 43 German troops remaining in the defensive position." Reader's Digest Canada writes that a German sergeant asked Corporal Ross, "Where are the rest of your men? You've been ordered to surrender because they were up against an unbeatable force of battle-hardened Canadians." "You're looking at them," Ross replied. The Toronto Star writes, "In the end, a small Canadian force defeated a larger enemy contingent and took over 80 prisoners." Wrote Corporal Dan Hartigan, "2 enemy soldiers for every Canadian paratrooper who fought in Varaville." The exploits of Company C of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion are representative of the thousands of troops that landed in France that day. Sometimes landed far from where they were supposed to be, often cut off from command, they formed together in small groups, and they figured out ways to meet their objectives. Notably, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion met all of their D-Day objectives on the first day. Very few units could say the same. But it came at a terrible cost. In the first 24 hours of the invasion, the battalion lost 116 casualties. And before the Battle of Normandy was over, they would lose 24 officers and 343 men. The Toronto Star concludes, "That invasion was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. What those Canadians did that day and over the next 14 months is the stuff of legends." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.